is huge, and then you need the other pocket for these other two. These other two are Veritatis Splendor and Letter to Families. Now, in Veritatis Splendor, he says this, I quote, "A freedom which claims to be absolute ends up treating the human body as raw datum, devoid of any meaning and moral value until freedom has shaped it according to its designs." Yeah? Can we see what this echo? He's commenting on what he's reading in the Majority Report. In Letter to Families, it's much more explicit. There he says, "The philosopher who formulated the principle cogito ergo sum," this is Descartes, of course, "I think, therefore I am," also gave the modern concept of man its distinctive dualistic character. It is typical of rationalism to make a radical contrast in man between spirit and body, between body and spirit. But man is a person in the unity of his body and spirit. Okay, so there he's directly pointing to one of these philosophers, Descartes, and saying, this is the problem that we've inherited, that the body and the person are estranged, and then the body can be, as it were, manipulated by contraception as if it was just a piece of raw matter, as he calls it. Yeah, if you want to see that, it does actually raise its head once explicitly in the Theology of the Body in Catechism 123. But I think what's important to understand about this is it's more the backdrop of the Theology of the Body. This is where he's coming from. So even if we have to turn elsewhere, aside from the Theology of the Body, to Veritatis Splendor and Letter to Families, to see this explicitly developed by John Paul II, I think the point is clear. Why does John Paul II major on the body in his presentation of anthropology? That's our question. Because the question about man, as it has been raised in our age, is first of all a question about the body. Because the upshot of the way of thinking we have from the Enlightenment is this estrangement, what the Holy Father sometimes calls a new Manichaeanism. And the danger of this dualism is that the body is seen as the junior partner, decidedly subhuman. And yet, according to John Paul II, it is precisely in the body that we can read the vocation that we all have from the Creator to self-gift. And it is precisely in the body that we can realize this vocation to self-gift. So obviously an estrangement of the body from the person is a way disastrous for us to realize our vocations as persons created in the image and likeness of God. So I think it's because of this that Dr. Waldstein can say ultimately in his introduction to his translation, I quote, John Paul II's main concern in the theology of the body is to help overcome the body-spirit dualism that emerged from placing nature in the position of an object of human power, making the body something to be imposed upon by the human person as if it was itself unhuman. Yeah. In the last catechism, again, and obviously this is a catechism to certainly be read, 133, the Holy Father indicates how the issue of contraception is therefore a microcosm. Again, why does he focus on this issue among other issues? Because it's a certain microcosm. It is a very practical manifestation of a more general question, a question about the nature of authentic human progress. Is progress to be measured only by our control over nature and the extension of technology over nature? Is this progress? Or is real human progress a progress that conforms to the truth about the human person? This question is asked very acutely in the question of contraception and conjugal morality. So which society has achieved more progress? The technologically advanced society, which has extended control over nature, or the society which has realized more self-control? Because the point is that the contraceptive mentality is a technological mentality that measures progress by imposition and power over nature. And we can easily fall into that. Okay, so far I have considered how the theology of the body is a response to three highly interrelated and vitally important questions of our age. I've considered the question of marriage, the question of man, and the question of the body. Now, from my reading of the theology of the body, I want to briefly suggest that there's two more questions of our age that we should consider before I finish. The first is the question of freedom, and the second is the question of love. Now, the question of freedom is clearly a central question for the pontificate of John Paul II. In Veritatis Splendor, he points out how that all the moral questions of our age, somehow they orbit around the question of what is human freedom. In Centesimus Annus, he points out that Leo XIII had already realized back at the end of in the end of the 19th century that the divorce of freedom from truth was the fundamental question of our age, and in fact the seed of very disastrous outworkings in the 20th century. So if you want to look at what he says generally about freedom, these are the two encyclicals particularly to look at. It's instructive to note that in Veritatis Splendor, this question that I've been looking at of power over nature is actually situated within the context of freedom, because the whole notion is that there's a question in people's minds that what is given to me by nature, is this somehow contrary to my freedom? I don't decide it. I don't decide to be a man or a woman. It's just given to me. Therefore, am I somehow unfree by that? Is nature the enemy of freedom? So this is the context of the question. But I think the important point for us to realize is that theology of the body shows how this is a mistaken view of freedom. If we think of freedom being that notion of the ability to determine everything and be determined by nothing, then we're in trouble. In theology of the body, the question of freedom comes up in this idea of the freedom of the gift. Yeah, freedom of the gift is this self-possession which is at the heart of what it means to be free. It's a prerequisite for self-giving, for love. So we see that theology of the body is a clear statement that freedom is for something. It is not itself an absolute. It is for love. The other important point, I think, made about freedom in theology of the body is that John Paul II points out in Veritatis Splendor that there's two opposing camps in regard to freedom, even in the modern mentality. Some make it an absolute, and some actually deny it. Some say that we are so conditioned by our biology and by our culture that really we don't make free choices. We just make responses. So we have this rather strange dichotomy, these two opposing views in the modern world. In regard to this second one, that we're not free, John Paul II's theology of the body is very concerned about the question of concupiscence and the truth that it can really limit our freedom. Disordered desires can really make us unfree, but he never falls into what he calls the error of the masters of suspicion, Nietzsche and Freud, particularly, who see man just totally given up to concupiscence and like this man, this unfree man, just responding to wild desires inside him. Because, of course, in the perspective of Christ, he knows that we have been set free. So in this regard, theology of the body is also a statement against this pessimism, which I think somehow, like a dark cloud, is above us, where we start to wonder whether we really are free. Okay, finally, the question of love. Yeah. In considering this question of the relationship between theology of the body and freedom, we've seen that freedom is for something. Freedom is for love. And it's clear that one of the titles that John Paul II gives to theology of the body is Human Love in the Divine Plan. So he obviously wants to make a statement about this question of love. Now, it would be too much to say that love is a question just of our age, is somehow like a perennial question. A colleague of mine told me recently that he had to make an appointment to go around to see his neighbors. I don't know about what. But they said that he couldn't come around in the morning because in the morning they always watch Mexican soap operas. Now, these neighbors were in their 80s. And what he concluded from that was that the question of love hadn't gone away from them. Because the heart of, I guess, Mexican soap operas is the question of romance. It's a perennial question for us. But what is a shame is that I think it would have been better for these octogenarian neighbors to have given an ear, not to Mexican soap operas, but to a Polish pope, who at the end of the 20th century seemed to be one of the few people who was really talking about love, thinking about love, and, dare we say, even talking and thinking about sex. Frank Sheed points out in his rather excellent book, Society and Sanity, that he says nobody thinks about sex anymore because this kind of testosterone-induced stupor which passes for thinking has nothing to do with rational activity. It's really this man that we need to turn to if we want to see what does love mean and what is its relationship with sexuality. Now, for John Paul II, it's clear that love is about self-gift. Yep. So in that way, even love falls under this so-called hermeneutic of the gift. John Paul II's, the key to his theology is this concept of gift. If you understand that, then many things in his theology kind of come into focus. And even way back when he wrote Love and Responsibility, that book is dominated by this question of what is love, and he comes to the conclusion ultimately love is self-gift, even beyond benevolence. It's the highest form of love. Benevolence is a well-wishing, to will the good of another in a more classical way of expressing it. But he says even beyond there is this love called gift of self, because in that love you don't just will the good of another, you make yourself, as it were, the other becomes the lord of you. You put yourself under the other. You give yourself totally to them. And this development which we see in Love and Responsibility receives a new impulse in the Second Vatican Council when he's clearly struck by this statement from Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 24, which became famous in his pontificate, which incidentally he was not the author of, but let me just briefly read it to you. Many of you will know it. But it says, "Indeed, the Lord Jesus, when he prayed to the Father, that all may be one as we are one, opened up vistas close to human reason, for he implied a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the unity of God's sons in truth and charity. This likeness reveals that man, who is the only creature on earth that God willed for its own sake, cannot find himself except by a sincere gift of self." So what happened was, in Love and Responsibility, a philosophical presentation of self-gift is thrown into a theological light. He suddenly sees that in the Trinity there is, analogously of course, this self-gift. And it's now possible to express this same concept of love and self-gift in a theological and Trinitarian way. And in a way, that one quote from Gaudium et Spes is like the theology of the body in an acorn. Everything unwraps itself from that idea, that in the Trinity there's self-gift and communion, therefore in human life, lived adequately, lived according to the truth that men are created in the image and likeness of God, there needs to be self-gift and communion. Yeah. Okay, a final point before I finish. Love and Responsibility calls this gift of self-love betrothed love. And Dr. Wallstein points out that clearly God is the exemplar of this gift of self. And if that's true, we have one component, one kind of, as we can say, part of the watermark that runs through the theology of the body, God is the exemplar of self-gift and communion. But as betrothed love, the spouses, the couples, are the human exemplar of this love. So, if we keep these two concepts, that the Trinity is the exemplar and the human spouses are the paradigm, and that love is a gift of self, we have what he calls the kind of three components, which are the guiding stars, all interrelated to each other, by which, if we keep that in mind when we read the theology of the body, we can see more clearly where John Paul II is going. Of course, this then has, I think, one more implication. If the spouses are the paradigm of human self-gift, then sexual intercourse must be the paradigm of the paradigm, because it is what is specific about marital love. If that is true, then clearly sexual intercourse must conform itself to the logic of self-gift, of gift of self. And therefore contraception is a contradiction of that. I think by that we reach the final point, the last catechesis, where he wants to make this commentary on Humanae Vitae. Now, this lofty presentation of human and conjugal love, which we find in Theology of the Body, I think is again, consciously or unconsciously, an outworking of another important statement from the Council, which John Paul II quotes quite often. In that document, which is the document on the training for priests, it says that moral theology should be renewed and nourished more on the teaching of the Bible, and it should shed light on the loftiness of the calling of the faithful in Christ. I think, again, John Paul II is situating moral theology in a new way. It's Christocentric, it's orientated, not perennial new, but new given what has